Welcome back to Agroforestry Through the Elements. I hope you're enjoying the season so far and are looking forward to another jam-packed episode recording from Agricology's podcast hub at the Agroforestry Show. Last week's episode explored the element of fire with Megan Gimber and Tom Fairfax, who provided some fascinating insights into how trees and hedges affect the generation and movement of energy within a farm system. Today we're focusing on the earth element, investigating how trees improve soil biology, structure and fertility. I'm joined by Thomas Gent and Paul Burgess to explore how agroforestry systems can play a fundamental role in supporting life below ground, supporting nutrient cycling and offering knock-on benefits for landscape productivity, ecology and climate resilience. Thomas is a fourth-generation South Lincolnshire-based farmer and founder of the award-winning Gentle farming brand. His farming ethos and business are both underpinned by a passion for healthy soils, aiming to drive a regenerative revolution in agriculture and pioneer the creation of UK soil carbon markets. Dr. Paul Burgess is a Professor of Sustainable Agriculture and Agroforestry at Cranfield University. It's safe to say that Paul is a real expert in this field, having authored and co-authored over 100 papers, published 8 book chapters and edited 3 books. He is currently the co-lead of the UKRI-funded Land Use for Net Zero Footprint project and a work package leader for a project called Digit AF that is developing digital tools to support agroforestry. I'm so excited to share this episode with you, so now the intros are out the way, let's get right on into it. Thomas, how are you getting on?
Awesome, how are you?
I'm good, mate, I'm good. How is life? What is on? What's happening in the world of Thomas Gent?
Well, that's a good question. Well, it's a lovely day. We're just trying to decide when to start planting wheat. I think that's the main thing that's on my mind. I think we're going to start next week.
Is that normal time? Is that late? Is that early? What sort of year are you working with?
No, I would say that's probably about normal. It is too dry, really. That's the problem. And it's just, do we try and wait till it rains a bit more, or do we plant it in the hope that it's going to rain? Who knows? I think it's always the thing of, if we had a crystal ball to predict the weather, I think farmers would be a lot richer, probably.
We would have nothing to complain about, and it would therefore very boring.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Actually, we'd have nothing to talk about at the pub. We'd be bored.
Exactly. That's it. Have you had, are you in that area of England that is just painfully dry summer, or have you had a bit of respite with some rain here and there? How's it been?
I know we had a crazy dry, spring till summer. I thought I had this bad feeling that we were going to, as soon as we got the combine out of the shed, it was going to start raining. But luckily we got it done. We probably got it done in record time, really, because it was so dry. But actually, our yields have actually been about average, which for this year is definitely something to celebrate.
100%. I mean, it's not what I've been hearing from everyone, so that's good. No, brilliant. Thomas, we're here. We're talking agroforestry through the elements. We're focusing on earth in this episode. So just give us a bit of background.
So we farm in east of England, on the Lincolnshire-Cambridgeshire border, just sort of near Peterborough. And we farm about 800 hectares, arable, combinable crops. And we've been kind of really focused on regen ag. And we've been fully no-till since 2008. And yeah, that was kind of our start of our journey into sustainable farming, let's call it. I definitely, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've definitely sort of seen agroforestry as the next step. It's just trying to figure out how to implement that in our system. We're not too far from Stephen Briggs. I used to work at Stephen Briggs Farm, actually. So I'm kind of very used to the system, let's say. But it's just, how do we make it fit into our farm? And how do we kind of not make the mistakes that other people have made when they've tried it?
Why is it the next step?
Yeah, good question. I think I think you can sort of put that probably into 2 buckets. I would say for me, it's probably emotionally the next step, if that makes sense. It depresses me a little bit to be in the fens sometimes with such big open fields with, few hedges. And I just think agroforestry would look amazing. That's probably the first reason, which is it's not a logical reason. It's just, I think it would be nice.
I think it is a logical reason. Well, it's not a. Is it an objective reason? No, it's not. It's a subjective reason, but it's very important, I think. I've spoken to a few people in this series. We've obviously been filming here and there, backwards and forwards. And And that is important. Character, impact on the person doing the job, i.e. the farmer, the producer, whatever, plays a pretty pivotal role in what's created at the end.
Yeah, definitely. The problem is, I think that's a hard reason to go to the bank with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for
So,
sure.
like, the reason I personally want to do it is more that. But I do think if you look at it a business reason as well, we are moving to an age where, I was actually out in Canada this year visiting some farms, and the scale of things out there, it just makes it, sometimes I just think, why are we even bothering trying to farm, wheat on a 2 hectare field when they're farming a field, the size of size of my whole farm, right? So I think for us in the UK, trying to stack our income is going to be so even more crucial going forward. And agroforestry, kind of 3D farming, as Stephen Briggs calls it, is definitely the kind of evolution of that, I guess, thinking.
Okay, got you. That makes sense. We'll come on to a short chat about maybe not unorthodox, but not a way many people are talking about to stack income from hectares, which we'll come on to in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to ask you you're looking at agroforestry as potentially your next step for the reasons you've just mentioned. And we had a chat a few weeks ago, and one of the things I'd I guess, spoke to you about was the relationship between organic matter and carbon storage and how that's linking into agroforestry in a system. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so on our farm, definitely, as I said, we've been focusing on our soils and improving our soil health, let's say. Our organic matter figures, I've got some records of Grandad going back, a long time ago, before we were really kind of focusing on it. And our organic matters are about 3 to 4%, which is about the average for the area that I farm, right? Now, if we do a organic matter test, obviously it's very variable, right? But we're getting some figures over 10% and sort of the lowest around 6-7%. So we've made a massive improvement just from the way that we've kind of farmed and the way we've added organic matter. So then the obvious evolution is, okay, how high can we go, right? And the best place to measure organic matter is in the woods, right, under a tree. So if we put those trees in the field, logically, that should improve the organic matter of the field. I think that's the logical thinking that everybody knows, right? Everybody knows if you go and measure organic matter in a forest, it's the best that you can get effectively. How close can we get that to that in a productive arable field is a really interesting conversation, I think, and something that we're trying to figure out. That's at the stage we're at. But I think the biggest practicality for implementing agroforestry on our farm is really is the mechanics, right, and the machinery, and how do we get them here? And we've, that's what I was talking about at the agroforestry show. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about an agroforestry cooperative, which is like really what we're trying to implement and trying to get off the ground.
Yeah, which is a fascinating concept, and I'm going to ask you about that. And just one thing I probably haven't said to everyone: this was filmed at the agroforestry show, and I'm guessing we sound slightly different than when Paul and I spoke, not only because Paul and Thomas sound different, but because it got very heavy rain at agroforestry show at the time Thomas and I filmed. So we are filming this sort of a week or so later. So we might refer back to our conversations here and there. So if that's the case, well, I don't apologise. That's just a reason that it's happened, just so you know.
It's great though, because I got a second try.
Here, what Thomas, do you know, it's like tribute from Tenacious D. What Thomas said the first time was perfect and no one's ever going to hear it. Only I had the privilege. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? Yeah, you go to that tree, you go under that tree, and your OM's high. Perfect. Yeah. But how far can that get away? Now, as someone that couldn't tell you the difference between an oak tree and an acorn, is like, are you looking for a what would you say, a shallow but extensive root system tree so that it's going elsewhere? Is that organic matter relating to the roots, or is it relating to the main trunk of the tree, therefore the roots doesn't actually matter? I assume that's the questions that everyone's looking into at the minute.
Yeah, so variety selection is like definitely what we're, I don't know the answer, right? It's a question, but the biggest, you get to the heart of the problem of regenerative farming, basically, right? Because the best thing for nature and the soil and all of that kind of thing is diversity. Effectively every plant in that field should be a different plant. Every tree should be a different tree, because that's maximum diversity, and therefore maximum, it's going to work best in a regenerative system. The problem is that's very hard to manage, firstly, but also to produce a productive crop from. there's probably a really interesting discussion which we're working a bit on, is on kind of robotics, and can that bring, get down to that kind of diversity of individual plants, maybe. But we kind of have those two factors that are battling each other. The best thing for the ecology and the plants and everything would be every tree to be completely different, but that then becomes with a lot of problems in terms of management and products and sales and all of that kind of thing. So the balance between those two, I think, is the thing that I'm thinking about the most.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thomas, you mentioned about a co-op. What are you talking about there?
Yeah, so this is the reason I was talking at the agroforestry show, actually. So I want to do agroforestry on my farm, right? What most people do when they get to that step is, okay, I want to do it, so I'm going to put a little experiment in, right? I'm going to do 10 acres or something small-ish of agroforestry just to learn how to do it, which is not the wrong thing to do. It's absolutely the right thing to do and really awesome. The problem with that is you have a lot of kind of diseconomies of scale. It's really hard to manage 10 acres of trees, right? Because, who's going to do it? It's not a full-time job. How should we get the right machinery? Because it doesn't justify all of that problems. So if we then, on the other end of the scale, the best thing to do would be to plant agroforestry on the whole farm everywhere, because then we can have the economies of scale. We can have the right people employed, the right machinery, all that kind of thing. At the minute, that's quite risky, right? Because nobody's really done it before at that scale. Is it the right thing to do? Is it going to affect land values? All of that kind of thing. So that then got me to the thinking of, why don't we look at it's effectively the same problem that all other agricultural industries have. So why don't we use the same solution that most other agricultural industry have and use a cooperative, right? I'm part of a grain cooperative where I'm part of Cam Grain Cooperative. So they have a central storage, farmers own a proportion of that storage facility. And so we can all share in the sort of risk of building it effectively, and then the operations of it and the use of it. So why can't we do a similar thing in agroforestry, where we can have an agroforestry cooperative organization that only maybe has 20, 50 acres of agroforestry on lots of people's farms, but together that means that we can justify the machinery spend and the infrastructure and the people and everything that's needed to manage that in a kind of good, profitable way. So that was the kind of theory, and I sort of came up with that theory a few months ago. Me and Dad trying to sit around the table wondering how we'd implement it on our farm. That led me to speaking to lots of random people, and I got invited to do a workshop about it at the agroforestry show, which was really good. And now we're just putting together a bit of a kind of strategy document of how do we move it forward. It got really, really good reception and lots of interest. And the question is, how do we now do that, basically?
I think that the first point of, you talked about the risk if you were to just put everything into woodland, that in itself kind of works against the diversity you're trying to put on the farm. It's not by any chance, by any stretch, a monoculture, but you're sort of limiting what you can put onto the farm, be that either other animal crops or livestock, depending on what route you go down.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it's quite risky if a farmer, because the best thing, it's the same balance that you have with everything, is the best thing for the economies of scale is to plant one tree across, a huge acreage, so I can get the right machinery and all of that sort of thing. But then you lose all of that diversity, and then you're quite heavily invested in one tree crop and all that kind of thing. Whereas if we can do it in a cooperative sense, you suddenly spread that risk and, work together much more. It should work. But trying to get a cooperative off the ground just for something a bit new like that, we'll see if it's possible. But I'm working on it.
The thing I like about this is sort of talking about maximizing, stacking, whatever we're going to call it, income from hectares. Is the good thing about this is it's scalable. Yeah, and if you've got a share in that co-op, and I'm guessing as someone who's involved in starting it, you will. There's real scope for your farm to stay the same size, but notably increase that income without even increasing hectares, and that's real stackability.
Yeah,
when you're
exactly.
stacking income on hectares that aren't there.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty impressive stuff.
That's my theory. Is should basically the members of the cooperative put in land to have agroforestry, and then that's their share within the organization, just like I own a share of storage and Cam Grain. Anyway, it's still an evolving debate about exactly how it should work. But the theory of a agroforestry cooperative has got a lot of interest at the minute, so we'll see if we can make it work.
Yeah, I think there's real scope. I think just listening in and without any sort of involvement in it, shall I say, that if you're quite nearby at first, if you guys are in the fens and you start with someone in Inverness, your cooperative isn't really actually going to help. But if you can sort of work nearby and then all go to the same plant, and then you get to the stage that as that expands, you can integrate your own plants and whatnot. It's fascinating, really interesting, really interesting.
Yeah, I'll come back and talk about it when it's got going.
So we'll have Thomas back on next month.
Yeah.
Another thing, Thomas, you're looking at, looking at the whole concept of stacking, is a thing that I've probably been quite, what is the word I would say, not in any way against, not even strictly hesitant of, but hesitant of the potential for it to be manipulated at the expense of producers, the small person, not the large company. For example, and you kind of changed my mind when we had a chat about this. So you're looking at carbon markets. How did you get into that? What made you think let's look into this?
Yeah, so with all good ideas, it started off that I was a bit bored. So I was a bit bored in lockdown, to be honest. And obviously I was on farm. I couldn't do much else. So I decided it would be quite fun to do some carbon assessments of our farm and some soil sampling. And we, as I said, at that stage, sort of 4 years ago, we'd been kind of 15 years ish into no-till, into regen farming. And so, doing those samples and comparing them to stuff that's happened in the past and doing kind of, on lots of those online carbon calculators, I learned sort of, I'm sure everybody knows it, but I learned it came to me that we were reducing the amount of carbon we were emitting a lot compared to kind of more conventional farming systems. And more excitingly, we were actually storing carbon in the soils, right? We do know that definitely happens, right? If you increase your organic matter, there is more carbon in the soil. So that was kind of one thing I could see happening on the farm by us doing those practices. And then on the other hand, I was, looking on the news, as everybody does, and you could see that there was lots of companies that were trading in this new thing called the carbon market and figuring out how it works. So, again, I was a bit bored in lockdown, so that made me think, okay, this sounds like an interesting opportunity. I should, see how it works and learn a bit more about it. And so I did. I thought the best way to learn about it was to just try it, basically. So I kind of set myself up. I got a bit organized. I started to, understand the kind of the specific numbers of the carbon storage on my farm. I went to some companies and I tried to, sell them some carbon credits. This seemed like a fun thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. So what I quickly learned was it's not that easy. You really, to be able to kind of trade in this carbon market, to be able to make it work as a proper system, all this kind of thing, you really do need a very sophisticated certification system and standard and registry system and legal structure. All of these complex things that I didn't really have in place. So, but it was clearly an opportunity. So I then went around and tried to find some organizations that were doing it and thought similar to me. And I came across a company called Agrina that was just starting in Denmark that were trying to do effectively what I was trying to do. They luckily had some investors and they'd got the legal structure and all of that stuff that I said that I hadn't thought about yet. But they were maybe lacking a little bit of farmer expertise. So it was a good partnership. So I worked with them and I've been working with Agrina for 5 years now, probably since they started. Yeah, we're now the largest soil carbon program in Europe. And we've just got our verification, which is a big deal in carbon markets, which we can talk about if you want.
So I guess the question is, or certainly the thing that jumps out is the random thing on a Sunday afternoon to kill time that wasn't as easy as that.
Yeah.
Should you have traded your carbon credits? Yeah, played around with 5% or whatever. How am I trying to say this? Is that opportunity, like, is that carbon credit gone? You've sold that. You can't gain carbon entitlements from that part, or how does that work? This is the part I don't fully get because I can't work out where it is between subsidy, crypto-esque, like where does it lie?
So I think I kind of understood your question. So So there's lots of ways to measure carbon, right? The way that the carbon market works really is that we assess it doesn't have to be soil carbon, anything that we're doing in the carbon markets, right? We assess the current situation, which could be, let's take trees because they're a little bit easier for people to understand. We have a field, we have no trees in the field, right? That's your baseline, a field with no trees. Then we decide we're going to go and plant some trees, right? Awesome, we planted some trees. Then obviously over the next 100 years or however long those trees grow, carbon is being absorbed by those trees. And every year, extra carbon is being absorbed by those trees because that tree is growing. So then every year you issue a number of credits based on what's happened in that year. And that allows you to have some credit. So that's what happens in soil carbon, right? We have a field. We look at the history of that field and the and the current situation of that field to give that field a baseline, which is its current situation. Every year, farming practices will happen on that field, be them good, be them bad, whatever they may be. So every year we do an assessment of that field to understand how has this field changed compared to the baseline. And that allows us to issue a number of credits. So it's really important for people to understand that you're not selling like the carbon stock that's kind of sitting there. You're selling and quantifying the additional carbon that you've added to that field in each year going forward, basically. And then that obviously allows you to be able to have a credit to trade. And that additionality point of new stuff happening is really, really important for the carbon markets, and it's effectively how the carbon markets work.
So you could trade with the carbon plus or negative, whatever it is, from hectare X 2025, and then you could also do that in 2026.
Yes.
Got you. Right.
But you can't do the same. It's not the same carbon ton. It's what have you added extra in 2026, and then what have you added extra in 2027, if that makes sense.
Which hugely incentivizes storing carbon. That makes sense.
Yeah. And it hugely incentivizes people to get better, like continuous improvement, which is a good thing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Okay. That makes so much sense because I've, and I think I said this to you at the show as well, I've spent so long worried for people that are producing that are not carbon or trading experts being, issues being caused, so that makes much more sense. And yeah, so I guess that the other thing is you mentioned about it's important to ask, what is Vera verification?
Yeah, so I think that just back to your point.
Yeah, of course.
Like it's really important that like nowadays there's a lot of talk about carbon, especially in the UK, and it's really important that farmers really understand the kind of contracts they're getting into, how it specifically works, and how make sure it's kind of a reputable company that's a brand that's recognized-ish and seen places, and not just kind of a random thing you've never heard of. Needed to make sure it's quite legit, and maybe some other farmers that are on it and all that kind of thing, because it is quite a quickly developing market. But yeah, so as I said, the bit that I struggled with at the start was how do I be able to kind of, as soon as I went to these companies that I could sell some credits to, obviously the first thing they asked me, which I should have known probably before I went there, is what standard and what verification have you got to prove that what you're saying in numbers actually happened, right? And when you start to scale up a carbon program, you need to have, the really highest standards in the world. So there's an organization called Vera. I'm never quite sure which one is. They are the global leader in carbon methodologies and carbon certification, basically. So what they do effectively is they write the rule book of how you can issue a carbon credit in different areas, right? So they have a forestry one, a soil carbon one, lots and lots of different ones. Obviously, we use the soil carbon one, and that effectively gives us a rule book of how do we go through the process. And then there's obviously an auditing process by a third party to be able to prove what you've done and what the calculations you've made. And then once everything's approved and everything's ticked off, that allows you to issue a credit. And then it is a credit. They have a kind of public registry, so you can see a list of all the credits that's ever been issued. And then once you've got that credit, obviously then it can be traded. But the verification for Vera is very, very tough to get. Green has spent years and years trying to get this verification, and we've actually just got verified in the last month. So yeah, it's a big milestone for the company at the moment.
Brilliant. And one small question, and I always like to say one small question to detract from the fact what I mean is one stupid question, because I was told there's no such thing. When you say you get a credit,
Yeah.
is it that simple, or do you get like 0.43 of a credit? How is a credit an amount, or how
Yeah.
does that work?
Yeah, I've talked about this stuff for so long. I always skip over the basics. But yeah, so one credit is 1 ton of carbon. That's effectively what
Okay.
it means, and it's either removed, so stored in the soil, or reduced. So if you say one credit, or you see one credit anywhere, that's 1 ton of carbon. And then obviously the number of credits or number of tons of carbon a farmer gets each year is going to obviously depend on the practices that they did that year. So depending on what they've done, then it will depend how many credits they've got.
And what is the quote unquote rough value of one credit
Yeah,
in monetary terms?
which I'm sure you're going to expect me, but I'm going to say it varies a lot.
For sure. No, I expected that. Yeah.
Yeah. But the current range of values we're seeing is sort of anywhere between about 15 to 40 pounds a credit at the moment in the market. But some credits definitely trade quite a bit higher. We have some, if it's kind of from a specific farm in a specific region near a specific buyer, and there's very kind of high traceability, then you can get over 50.
Okay.
So it's quite, it's a new market that's evolving pretty rapidly, but there's some big values in it when you start to add up all the hectares.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that's where economies of scale is coming in. Yeah, makes sense. Just to wrap up, Thomas, this is a episode focusing on Earth, focusing on the soil. One thing that people are going to want to know is can this work for me? Can this work at home? So how realistic is it for farmers to tie soil carbon into there? We spoke about it right at the start. The bank's not going to listen to it's pretty. How realistic is it for them to tie that into their business model?
Yeah, so I think nowadays there's such an interest from really everybody in, firstly, the supply chain, but also in the broader society in carbon and carbon storage. So essentially, if you're a farmer anywhere that farms some land that has some soil that they look after, there is a potential to do something with carbon. The biggest opportunity at the moment, and the kind of easiest path at the moment, is really large scale kind of arable farming systems, because it's there's a scalable element, and it's quite there's very sophisticated processes now to be able to monitor and measure and verify the number of credits that can be issued. And there's also really big opportunities in supply chains as well. That we've got the likes of big companies, Mars, Nestle, all of those people have got very high and mighty net zero and regenerative farming targets. So engaging with those sort of people is such a big opportunity at the minute, and it's really crazy if farmers aren't kind of getting involved. And the thing that I always try to relate to people is, as we explained, every year, you're going to get a carbon figure every single year. And so every year that you go past, it's just like not bothering to harvest your wheat. You've done all the work. You've done all of the work to be able to store that carbon in your soil. It's happened. You might have grown a cover crop, whatever you might have done. So, don't miss out the bit of just measuring it and verifying it to be able to produce it effectively. You don't have to sell it, but you need to make sure you measure it. It's just the same as you need to make sure you get your combine out of the shed and harvest your wheat.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But here, Thomas, thank you very much for coming on.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Paul, for those listening, who is Paul Burgess? What do you do yourself?
Yes, so my name's Paul Burgess. I'm a professor in sustainable agriculture and agroforestry at Cranfield University. That's a postgraduate-only university based in Bedfordshire, where we run a range of master's courses, PhD programs, and research topics related to agri-food and the environment.
And just off the bat, what is agroforestry to you?
So I think I originally did an agricultural degree, and in that degree we never mentioned trees at all. And what I see agroforestry, it's really just the interaction between farming and trees. So it can be bringing farming into sort of forestry, or trees and orchard crops more into farming. And it's that sort of deliberate integration of trees, within a farm business to benefit from those ecological and economic interactions.
Yeah, and it's funny asking everyone that, because everyone's got the same thing at the heart of what they say, but I like what parts are important to each person and plucking each little bit. So from a benefit perspective to an agricultural unit, what is that bringing to a farm system?
Well, there's a whole potential range of benefits. Very often, well, I guess when we're talking about farming, it's primarily producing about food and other crops, may be sort of fibre. So typically that's the primary business of any sort of farming business. So very often when we're talking about trees, is how does trees support and complement that main business? So it could be providing a shade and shelter to livestock. It could be reducing soil erosion in an arable system. So I would see perhaps the first benefit is maintaining and being complementary to that main enterprise. And then there are potential options in terms of bringing in a new product onto the farm. So apples, firewood, biomass crops, other fruit crops, nuts. So in some situations, that's perhaps the output of agroforestry. And I guess the third area is those sort of environmental and social benefits, for often which there isn't a market for, but which as a society we need. It's sort of carbon storage, improving water quality, preventing soil erosion, constraining water flows. So sensible integration of trees and farming can address each of those three areas, I think.
You mentioned environmental and social there, and the examples were very environmental. What are social benefits?
So agri-tourism, sort of perhaps. So, a good number of farms might have sort of a campsite associated with it, bed and breakfast in some sort of locations, farm shops. So integrating trees into those makes a more sort of pleasant environment for your customer or your visitor. So that would be sort of one sort of cultural sort of area.
And I think, just as you're speaking there, I've had that little twig in my head. And I love that about these series, because you're speaking to someone in so many different angles of it, and suddenly you think something differently. I've almost exclusively thought of agroforestry as trees on farms. Is there examples of forestry diversifying by adding agriculture?
Yes, so traditionally, in many situations, if you look at agroforestry globally, that is the situation. Yeah. So the potential of bringing in sort of crop products into a sort of forest environment. So, for instance, cocoa production in sort of West Africa can sort of take place within a sort of forest sort of environment. So that's why I say very often it's the integration of farming with trees, because it can operate in both directions. It's not just trees into farming. Sometimes it can be sort of farming into a sort of tree system.
Do we see any examples of that in the UK?
I guess looking at agroforestry over a sort of decades, very often there might be a sort of woodland area on a farm that you open up to sort of livestock on a farm, and then that sort of starts a cycle. Maybe over time the tree density will diminish, but in another part of the farm you might plant a woodland, and that starts the new process. And I think Vera used to argue, if we look at trees on a farm over a 40-50 year period, it might sort of follow this cycle. Plant a woodland, as the woodland sort of matures, maybe you open it to grazing. Over time perhaps tree density declines, and then you come back and start the cycle again another 40-50 years on.
Which is much more sustainable, because if you go down the route of not that, you just get deforestation.
Yes,
for sure. Yeah.
So there's both the spatial aspects of agroforestry, but this long time period as well, because trees grow so slowly, the system evolves over time. So as a farmer, you would need to adapt how you integrate those trees and what you do with the trees on the farm will change and evolve over time.
That's a really good point. The life cycle of it, the environmental, the political, the whatever standards will be different when that tree's a sapling than when it's a tree.
Yeah,
that's a really good
I've just come out of an interesting talk on sort of hedgerows, which talks about this cycle over a generation. And if you want to maintain your hedgerows at, past 40 or 50 years, the need to sort of rejuvenate it by sort of hedge laying, etc. So that long-term cycle we often don't see because we focus on the here and now, but in the broad context, things evolve slowly over time.
Paul, tell us a bit about your work with Cranfield. With an agroforestry hat on, what are some trials that you're working on that you're allowed to talk about?
I think I could talk about
all of them.
About most of them. So my personal journey, I did an agricultural degree. I was fortunate enough to do some work in the tea industry in East Africa for 4 or 5 years. And when I came back to the UK, they said I joined the lecturing staff at Cranfield University, and Professor Steve Newman and others at that time had established an experimental agroforestry site there, and I was instructed on arrival, you've been working with perennial crops, can you do some work on this agroforestry experiment? So that was managing an agroforestry experiment with colleagues from the University of Leeds and the Royal Agricultural University. One thing with trees is they grow slowly, so you've got a 3-year research project, but you need to understand what happens over 25 years. So that took me into the area of modelling, describing the growth of trees and the interactions with crops over sort of 10, 20, 30-year periods, and feeding that into economic analyses. That took me to the management of a European project called Ag Forward, where we worked with 40 stakeholder groups across Europe, looking at different forms of trees on farms. And more recently, we've been looking at digital tools for agroforestry in a European project called Digitaf. And that sort of modelling of trees on farm has also taken us into the area of sort of greenhouse gas accounting.
That quite interesting. You say, when you sort of come back from working in the tea industry. How long ago was that? Sorry, Paul.
So we're still doing work on the tea, but yes, that was initially sort of 25, 30 years ago.
So is how, and I don't want to say accurate because that always sounds like a big critique, but how in line with that model that was created then are we actually currently now, given we're almost 30 years on?
Yes, so it's a good question. So I think, the models that we sort of developed and that sort of processes that inform the model sort of hold true. Some of the focus perhaps changes. So when we did the initial agroforestry work, it was on very often individual species. And when we did the initial work, sort of carbon wasn't really an issue that's come to the fore. So as we were sort of talking before, because of the length of time for trees to grow, you may start with one objective, but it's having that flexibility and adaptability as markets change to reorientate the business and what you can do with the trees. But the basic process is the importance of having a sort of balanced sort of portfolio. Those are all things I think that add resilience and strength to a business.
I think that's it. I mean, with a trial based on a tree, yes, you can consistently monitor where you are, but you can't go from start to finish. Whereas a wheat crop, for example, next year you've okay, that did this, let's try again. Which I hadn't considered, to be fair. How has agroforestry research? Because I assume when it started, when you were involved 25 years ago, it was in its infancy to a point. How's that sort of transformed over the last couple of decades?
I think, so the initial work, some of it was sort of quite technical, measuring what the yield of the trees were, the yield of the crops. We did some sort of biodiversity measurements and sort of economics. And we're looking at some of the science and the economics of that interaction of trees with crops. I think that process of thinking about agricultural production and trees within the same framework is what sort of one of the key lessons. So although we sort of focused on sort of widely spaced trees, that interaction of trees and agricultural production can be done at a range of scales. So perhaps we initially looked at a field scale, but you could look at it at a farm scale as well. So it's thinking systematically about a farm business, not just today I'm just focusing on the crops and then the trees here. How do they interact together at a farm level?
Yeah, which I think it's very easy to focus on and let's use agroforestry as an example. Okay, there's this piece of growing biomass on the ground. How much biomass, or for example. But yeah, it's that sort of integrated system makes much more sense. What are the big topics you're working on at the minute?
So, an area we're working at present with 3 greenhouse gas calculator companies and 4 other institutions across the UK and Savills to look at greenhouse gas accounting at a farm level. So that's looking at how do we sort of scale up that sort of process, because it's important in terms of moving the country to net zero, but at a sort of farm level, understanding the sources of emissions, how you can reduce them whilst maintaining profitability and food production. And again, what are the options then and the benefits of integrating trees within that and on a farm level?
So, I don't even know how to say that, to be fair. I think that, I guess the questions based on the calculator thing, how does that work, working with 3 different greenhouse gas calculators? Because I assume they're not exactly the same, hence why you're using 3. Will that eventually come to a stage where you think there'll be like sort of a industry accepted one version, or do you think there's value in having 3?
Yeah, so it's a journey. It's a developing area. Each of those calculators have unique selling points. They have different sort of system boundaries, but they are the 3 calculator companies we're working with: Agricalc, a Farm Carbon Toolkit, a Cool Farm Tool. They've made a commitment to be sort of transparent in their approaches, and they're open to working with other companies if they can take a similar sort of transparent approach. So it's a journey, and they're learning from each other. Where do you get data from? And although at this stage they will produce different numbers because they're sort of trying to do different things. One may focus on emissions per product, another one emissions per farm. And also it's a developing area as well. Coefficients perhaps change over time. So it's a research project, I guess, lubricating the first part of that journey so that over the next sort of 10, 15 years we can develop a more cohesive, scalable offering in that sector.
I think that attitude of just being transparent, this is new and we're working, well, not new, but it's in its infancy, I guess. Working towards that is the way that has to work. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Just as we sort of draw this part to a close, Paul, I wanted to sort of focus on, we're here at Agroforestry Show, so we've got people that are working in livestock sectors, we've got horticulturalists, we've got arable units, we've got whatever, really. Some of the people we've spoken to already are sectors that, after interviewing 450 people in this sector, that I haven't came across. So really, real variation. I'm going to guess there is place for agroforestry in all of these production spheres.
Yeah, I think a key thing that we're learning is the importance of diversity. There is a place for intensive agriculture, and there's benefits that can provide, and that enables areas of conservation as well. But society and things work best where there's a mixture of and diversity of business types, and because the environment and the landscape we work in the UK is variable. One part of the farm might be quite steep, another part quite sort of flat. What's appropriate in specific areas won't always be the same. So having that sort of mixed mosaic portfolio in most cases, unless you're in a totally uniform sort of space, makes sense.
And I think on that, the last ecology podcast we filmed was called To Till or Not to Till. Just a debate from people that believe you should put a plough in the ground all the way to you shouldn't. And the biggest thing that came up was the whole concept, it's a regenerative concept of context. And I think it's extremely valuable. I think we can't consider farming as this blanket, you do this thing, and that's really important. But let's try and do it. I'm going to put you in the spot here and try and do it for a second. let's take a pretty, average mixed farm. It's got livestock, it's got arable, it's got whatever. What are the biggest benefits you've found in the last, pretty much a career dedicated to agroforestry, of forestry on farms? What are the big standouts?
So I guess the first thing is to understand already what's there. So agroforestry is it's a sort of way of thinking about trees and the integration on a farm. So I remember going to a flat open area in Italy, and they say, we're going to show you some agroforestry. And we were taken to this big flat open field, and the fields were, a kilometre by a kilometre. And then every 100 metres, they had put in a row of trees and said, this is agroforestry. And you look at it and you think, well, this is just a hedgerow system that we just call farming in the UK. So in a way, understanding, large parts of the UK, we have an agroforestry landscape, but we've never sort of called it that. We've got hedgerows, woody perennials, providing shelter, in keeping sort of livestock where they're supposed to be, sort of preventing soil erosion and sort of runoff happening from one field to the next, breaking up the land so you can manage it in units that have specific soil types. So I guess the first thing is to appreciate what you've already got and think, yes, trees are a part of our cultural heritage and also the business. So there's research then on livestock farms showing that the benefits of shade, hedgerows in upland areas, sort of reducing exposure in winter. Say if you're sheep farming, so is the situation with woodland eggs. In that sort of situation, if you've got free range hens, the natural habitat for the hens is sort of an understory. So releasing them into an open grass field doesn't make sense. So that's become a sort of mainstream practice, integrating trees on those farms. So there's all of those things, and I think going back to that sort of greenhouse gas sort of calculator space, as supermarkets and consumers and processors are looking for a move towards net zero, again, integration of trees on the farm and within the broader business also comes more to the fore as well.
So I guess with focus on your research, we're talking about here at the Agroforestry Show, we're trying to look into this episode of Earth, that connection with the soil. What have your research in that soil world, focus on agroforestry, been?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting the setup that you've got. So thinking about how you've set up the story, you've got soil, is it air, fire, water, and people.
You've remembered that better than me.
And there's sort of 5 elements around that we're looking at in the context. In the middle, if we're focusing on agroforestry, is that interaction of crops, trees, and livestock. Mm-hmm. So if I was sort of drawing a diagram of how I understand this sort of presentation, we've got that interaction of trees, crops and livestock in the middle, and then we're looking at some of those interactions then with air, water, soil, people, and fire and other sort of issues around it.
Yeah.
And we're looking at those interactions. So soil is an area that's sort of, we've talked about groundswell earlier on, is this increasing focus on regenerative agriculture. And if I go back sort of 20 years ago when we were talking about soil, we were generally talking about soil fertility. How does a soil provide nutrients? How can you provide nutrients for a crop? What's the ability of a soil to produce a crop? So we used the phrase soil fertility. I think in recent years, this concept of soil health has come to the fore, which has a sort of broader understanding of soil. Yes, we want the soil to be able to produce crops, but there's also other things that we want the soil to do. We want it to regulate water flows, to control soil erosion. We want it to retain nutrients as well. And this idea of soil being living as an ecosystem. That's a sort of key sort of metaphor that comes with sort of soil health. So this focus on soil health, focusing on the depth of the soil, the physical characteristics of soil, the chemical characteristics of soil, and the biology of soil. These are all things where there is a role there for trees.
What impact are trees having on those things you mentioned?
So when you go to Groundswell and they talk about the sort of principles of regenerative agriculture, the key sorts of things are protecting the soil, maintaining that sort of canopy cover, minimizing soil disturbance, having a diversity of crops, understanding the sort of context. Those are all things, by integrating trees within the system, you can achieve as well. You can also achieve a lot of those by incorporating grass into the system. So both grass and trees are perennial sort of crops for that, minimizing soil disturbance, improving soil health, getting that diversity in. They're all sort of regenerative practices that try and enhance the health of the overall system.
Is there species of trees that offer set benefits across those pillars? You know, birch does one, oak does, or are they sort of, as a tree, are they doing all of these things in different levels?
At a sort of high level, I guess the key things trees are doing is the perennial nature, the long-term nature. You've got an established root system that's there permanently, going to larger depths probably than grass. So there's sort of interactions at a grass level, at a deep soil level, are more important. The perennial nature means it provides a habitat long term. So those are all common things with trees. I guess the key thing is choosing the tree species that's appropriate for a particular soil type. So some tree species benefit from a calcareous soil, some won't tolerate it at all. So choosing the appropriate tree species or allowing the appropriate tree species for a particular soil type can be useful. Some tree species provide sort of fruit and increase sort of resources that can enhance biodiversity. Some select species might be associated with a pest and you don't want them on your farm. Some tree species can fix nitrogen, alder, for instance. Some can cope well with wet conditions, willow, poplar, but put them in a more dry area, they don't function so well. So there are those sorts of interactions.
The concept of nitrogen fixing trees is interesting. You've got peas, beans, whatever, you know, it doesn't matter. You've got them across the field. The nitrogen fixation is happening across the field. How far from a tree will it fix?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess as far as the tree roots have gone. I know at Bangor University they had an area there of alder that they planted in an agroforestry site. And I think they have tried to sort of quantify the ability of the trees in a grassland system to fix nitrogen. It's part of the equation.
So someone's sitting at home with I always say they're sitting at home. They don't have to be sitting. They could be standing or walking. It doesn't matter. If they've got a farm, regardless of what that farm is, from a soil perspective, what would your advice be if they were potentially looking at integrating an agroforestry system?
So firstly, understand what you've already got. So very often we think, we need to plant and do something new. But on many farms in the UK, there's hedge lines, hedgerows, understanding what's been there in the past. So there'll be copses on a farm. So making best use of those is almost the first thing to bank. Understand your long-term plan for the farm, successional sort of issues. What do you want from the farm? Are there areas of the farm that you never receive a profitable crop from? Is that an appropriate area to sort of plant trees? Are you suffering soil erosion in a particular area? So identifying those broad aims and objectives for the farm, and then sitting down with someone who's working locally in your area, so This agroforestry show is sponsored by the Woodland Trust. They have advisors who know specific areas, so they can sort of explain, oh, this will work in this particular location. So sitting down with someone who's knowledgeable, I think is useful.
Brilliant. Well, we covered soil there. I get caught up sometimes in other things. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.
It's been great fun.
Thank you for listening to episode 3 of Agroforestry Through the Elements. I'm Wallace Currie, and this podcast is produced by Agricology, your go-to destination for practical, sustainable farming resources and advice. Just a reminder that all of the past Agricology podcast seasons and episodes are available to listen for free on Libsyn, Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Agricology newsletter to stay up to date with future episodes. Agricology would love to hear your thoughts, comments and reflections about the topics covered in this podcast series. You can contact them via email, comment below, or drop them a DM on one of our social media platforms. Join me next time for episode 4, where we'll be talking about air with our guests Martin Crawford and Helen Browning.